Shalom, this is Bill. In our last explainer, we took apart the honeycomb objections. This time, we're looking at two arguments that work differently than anything we've tested so far. We are not appealing to a story here, or to outside scholarship. These are close readings of the exact same chapter that first classified the bee. The idea is that Leviticus itself, if you read it carefully enough, might leave a door open for honey.
Here is the first objection, and before we get into it, I want you to understand where it comes from. This is a long-standing interpretive tradition, and it's still alive today. A number of ministries teaching on clean and unclean foods lean on this exact principle right now to defend bee honey, so it deserves a careful answer, not a quick dismissal. Leviticus 11, verses 29 and 30, lists 8 specific creatures: the mole rat, the mouse, the great lizard, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. Then, verses 32 through 34 lay out the rule for what happens when a dead, unclean creature falls into your food or your water. The argument says that this food-defiling rule only applies to those 8 named creatures. Bees aren't on the list. Neither is a clam, a fly, or a lobster. So under this reading, a dead bee falling into honey wouldn't make the honey unclean at all.
Let's slow down and read the text the way it was actually written. The chapter has a habit worth noticing. Every single time this chapter means only part of the swarming class, it explicitly says so. The water swarmers are called of the waters. The flying swarmers, where the bee was placed back at verse 20, are called winged. The 8 ground creatures are marked on the ground. 3 different subsets, 3 different markers. This isn't a careless writer. This is a writer who names the group every single time he means a part of it.
Then we reach verse 31, right after those 8 ground creatures are named, and the marker disappears. These are unclean to you among all that swarm. No of the waters, no winged, no on the ground. The exact qualifier this chapter had used every time up to this point is gone. In its place stands one word, kol, all. This is the hinge of the whole objection. A writer who marks the subset every time, who had written on the ground just one verse earlier, doesn't reach for the word all by accident. If he had meant only these 8, the word was sitting right there in his hand. He had just used it. He chose the other word instead. The text knows exactly how to say ground, but at verse 31, it says all.
And it matters where that word is standing. Verse 31 isn't a summary tacked onto the 8. It is a doorway. The next breath is the rule that defiles our food. And anything on which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean. Whether it is an article of wood, or a garment, or a skin, or a sack, any article that is used for any purpose, it must be put into water, and it shall be unclean until the evening. Then it shall be clean. The them whose fallen bodies defile that food reaches back to the all that swarm of verse 31, not to the ground of verse 29. So the question was never whether the bee is one of the 8. It never had to be. Everything this chapter had already named as a swarming thing, including the bee back at verse 20, stands inside the all that verse 31 gathers up just one breath before the food is touched.
A bee dying inside the comb it built, inside the substance it's producing, isn't a stretch of this principle. It may be this principle in its plainest possible form. Think about what this means in practice. Under this loophole reading, if you're making a pot of soup and a dead oyster or a clam ends up in it, you haven't defiled anything. You just fish the clam out and the soup is fine because oysters and clams aren't on the list of 8 either. But if a mouse falls into that same pot, or a lizard, the whole pot is unclean. You can't fish the mouse out and keep eating. This reading turns dozens of other unclean swarming creatures into a free pass as long as their name doesn't appear on this one list. That is not a small side effect. That is the entire animal kingdom's worth of unclean swarming things suddenly harmless to your dinner. The food rule was never keyed to which name happens to appear in a list. It was keyed to the word Ha-Sheretz, and verse 31 draws that word as wide as it goes, all that swarm.
Isaiah gives us a second witness here, independent of Leviticus. Describing people who eat what Yahweh forbids, he names the exact mechanism we have been tracing, who sit in tombs and spend the night in secret places, who eat pig's flesh, and broth of tainted meat is in their vessels. Broth is liquid that's steeped with a carcass. The prophet doesn't need to explain why that makes it unclean. Everyone already understood it. A liquid that has held death doesn't stay separate from what it held. And notice he doesn't limit this to the 8 swarming ground creatures either.
Haggai reaches the exact same conclusion through a different door, a passage with nothing to do with Ha-Sheretz or any list at all. Thus says the Lord of hosts, ask the priests about the law. If someone carries holy flesh in the fold of his garment and touches with his fold bread or stew or wine or oil or any kind of food, does it become holy? The priests answered and said no. Then Haggai said, if someone who is unclean by contact with a dead body touches any of these, does it become unclean? The priests answered and said, it does become unclean. Notice what is on the table there. Not sacrifices, not altar portions, bread, stew, wine, oil, ordinary kitchen food, touched by death, ruled unclean, with no list of exceptions given anywhere.
Two passages, two different eras of Israel's life, one verdict. Death moving into food makes it unclean, and no road back is given. The objection needs verse 31 to say these 8 only, but it says the opposite, all that swarm. The text knew exactly how to say ground. It didn't say that. It said all.
Now for the second objection. This one is the longest-running defense Honey has, so it deserves a careful, patient answer. Leviticus 11:34 says, "Food becomes unclean on which water comes." The argument reads that phrase as a condition. Water has to touch the food first before a dead, unclean creature landing on it can defile it. Dry food, under this reading, is immune until it has been wetted. Honey, sealed in wax, untouched by water, would fall outside the verse's reach entirely. This reading rests on a rabbinic framework called Hekhsher, and an entire tractate of the Mishnah was built to work out its details. It is a serious tradition, and I am not a Hebrew scholar. What I am is a careful reader of Torah, and when I sit with this verse and ask what it would actually look like in a real kitchen, the framework starts to strain.
Here is the verse again. Any food in it that could be eaten, on which water comes, shall be unclean, and all drink that could be drunk from every such vessel shall be unclean.
There are two ways to read it. The rabbinic reading treats on which water comes as a trigger condition. Before you can even ask if a food is clean or unclean, you first have to determine whether water has touched it. The plain reading treats the same phrase as a description of the category, food of the kind water can touch, washable food, an apple, a piece of bread, the kind of food where you might look at a dead bee sitting on it and think, could I just rinse this off? And the verse's answer is no. Even that food, even the food you might reasonably think you could rescue, is unclean. Then the verse moves to the other category, drink. The liquid you can't wash because it is the liquid itself, soup, wine, milk, honey, also unclean if death has touched it in any vessel. Every escape route a person might reach for gets closed, one after the other.
Now picture what the rabbinic reading asks of an ordinary household. You walk into your storage room. There is a dead bee on an apple. Under that reading, you can't simply say the apple is unclean and throw it out. First, you have to work out the apple's water history. Did dew settle on it overnight? Did rain reach it through the window last week? Did someone rinse it before storing it? If none of that happened, it's fine. If any of it did, it's unclean. The rabbis themselves wrote chapter after chapter trying to navigate exactly these questions because the framework is difficult for ordinary people to apply in real time. The plain reading asks one question. Did death touch your food? Then it is unclean. No water history required.
For those who want to look at the Hebrew directly, the case for the plain reading isn't just intuitive, it is grammatical. Leviticus 11:34 contains two parallel relative clauses describing the food, both beginning with the same word, asher, and both using the same verb form. The first clause is, which may be eaten. Nobody reads that as food currently being eaten this moment. Everyone reads it as a category, edible food, food of the kind that gets eaten. When the second clause follows the exact same pattern, which water comes upon it, the natural reading is also a category, food of the kind water touches. That is not a stretch. That is honoring the parallel structure the Hebrew itself hands us.
A careful reader might raise a fair objection here. What about verse 38, a few lines later, which says that if water is put on seed and a carcass falls on it, the seed becomes unclean? Doesn't that prove water application is exactly what triggers susceptibility? At first glance, maybe, but the Hebrew is doing something different in that verse. Verse 34 uses a relative clause describing a category, the same construction as which may be eaten. Verse 38 uses a conditional, and if water is put. That is a completely different grammatical move. It introduces a specific triggered event, not a description of a category. The two verses aren't saying the same thing in the same way because they aren't built the same way. The rabbinic framework has to fuse them into one single susceptibility rule. The Hebrew itself keeps them apart.
There's more worth naming here, too. The seed in verse 38 is explicitly identified 2 verses earlier as seed meant for sowing. The natural reading carries that same seed forward, meaning water applied to seed already in the ground, not seed being prepared as a meal. This isn't a reading invented for this study. The medieval commentator Ibn Ezra reads the verse this exact same way, seed watered in the field. Rashi reads it differently, as seed soaked for eating, and it's Rashi's reading that the later Hekhsher framework depends on. The tradition itself is not unanimous on this point. Whatever verse 38 is actually doing, it doesn't establish a general susceptibility rule for verse 34's food and drink.
There is one more piece of evidence worth sitting with, and it comes from what the passage doesn't say. Across the whole span of Leviticus 11:24 through 40,
Every single category of contaminated thing receives a stated remedy, a timeline, or an exemption. A person who touches a carcass, unclean until evening. Someone who carries one, wash the clothes, unclean until evening, then clean. Wood, cloth, skin, a sack, dipped in water, unclean until evening, then clean. Earthenware, broken. An oven or a stove, smashed. A spring or a cistern, exempted entirely. Every category has a pathway. Every category, except food and drink in verse 34. They receive nothing. Unclean. Period. That missing remedy isn't an oversight. Look at how careful this passage is everywhere else. The person gets a timeline. The garment gets washed. The vessel gets broken. The spring stays clean by exemption. Every category is handled. And then food and drink are handed nothing at all. In a passage this precise, that is not a gap. That is a verdict.
Now, one more move, and this one closes the door regardless of which reading anyone finds more persuasive. Even granting the rabbinic Hekhsher framework in full, honey still doesn't escape, because honey isn't the kind of food that framework even governs. Honey is drink. Mishnah Makhshirin 6.4, the exact same tractate built to elaborate the susceptibility framework, lists the 7 liquids the rabbis themselves classify as true liquids. There are 7 liquids: dew, water, wine, oil, blood, milk, and bees' honey. Bees' honey is named there by the rabbi's own and, in their own list, sitting right alongside wine and milk and oil, classified as a drink.
And Leviticus 11:34's drink clause has no water condition attached to it at all, and all drink that can be drunk from every such vessel shall be unclean. No wetness requirement, no prior condition. Drink is the substance you can't rinse because it's the substance itself. So even setting aside everything else in this question, even granting the rabbinic reading its fullest strength, honey is still unclean by the rabbi's own framework. The susceptibility rule governs solid food. Honey isn't solid food. Honey is drink by their own definition, and the drink clause has no escape written into it anywhere.
The Hekhsher tradition is a historical and significant body of scholarship, and I have tried to engage it seriously here rather than wave it off. But tested against the parallel grammar of verse 34, against the silence running through verses 24 to 40, and against the rabbi's own classification of bees' honey as drink, the framework doesn't carry the weight this objection has asked it to carry, at least not for our question. 2 objections, both close readings of the same chapter, both looking for a door the text simply doesn't open. All that swarm reaches the bee, and the water condition, however carefully argued, never reaches far enough to rescue what the rabbis themselves already called drink. That's next.